My next guest on Stronger Bones Lifestyle podcast is Evan Hirsch, MD. He's also known as the EnergyMD. He's a world-renowned fatigue expert, best-selling author, and professional speaker. He's the creator of the EnergyMD Method, a science-backed, clinically proven 4-step process for resolving long COVID and chronic fatigue naturally. So listen in as we discuss the straws that break the camel's back when it comes to chronic fatigue or long COVID. Ironically, are similar straws that can lead to osteoporosis. So tune in and listen to this discussion to understand how we get into this depleted state, whether it's with our energy or with our bones. Okay, so let's begin and let's start off with what is the link or the relationship between chronic fatigue and bone health?
So a lot of people don't realize that the causes are very similar. So oftentimes when people do have osteopenia or osteoporosis, and they also have fatigue, oftentimes they don't realize that they're actually linked. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is what I call the toxic 5, which are very much present in both conditions.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. So do you want to lead into the toxic 5 or do you want to talk more about chronic fatigue?
Yeah, no, let's jump in there. So the toxic 5 is a combination of heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction. Now, all of these things are related to bone health in the sense that some of these directly and some of these indirectly are all going to influence the health of your bones. So heavy metals, chemicals, molds, they've all been implicated in decreasing bone health. Infections and nervous system dysfunction, in addition to the rest, are all going to compromise your hormonal systems, your HPA axis, ovaries, thyroid, etc., which in turn will compromise your bone density and your bone health. Now, so those are what I consider to be the real root causes of chronic fatigue syndrome, and now long COVID as well. And they just happen to have that crossover. And there are other deficiencies that we can talk about, but I find that those are really the real root causes, those toxic 5 that I just mentioned.
Yeah, and then when we start at those, so if you're talking, so let's talk about we'll go to the nervous system and chemical in a little bit. Let's talk about the first part though, the yeast, the molds, and heavy metals. So how would somebody know that that's a causal factor for them? How do they know they have that?
Well, usually, so there's two things. One is, whether if they have chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID, they all have it. So, and they all have all of the toxic 5. So this is what I've learned over the last decade in specializing in this work and running thousands of different laboratory tests, is that I found that the toxic 4, the heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and infections, pretty much all of them in every category come out over the course of a year. So as I was mentioning offline, I don't test for these toxins anymore because everybody that I work with, I treat all of them, because the last thing that we want is after 12 months or so to say, oh gosh, I really wish that I ordered, that we treated molds, because unfortunately the testing is imperfect. And the reality is that everybody that I work with, they have these issues. So it just so happens that most, in terms of, I don't work with a ton of people who have osteoporosis, but for the people who I do, their osteoporosis gets better, they improve their bone density, etc., when we remove the toxic 5 as well. So that's the crossover that I see.
Yeah, and the thing is, we're exposed our whole lives, and even more so now. I think that that's the big thing. I always think about driving to Las Vegas when I was a girl and seeing all the bugs on the windshield and on the grate of the car, and they're not there anymore. And so there's a lot of invisible stuff happening in our world, in our food supply, in our air, in our water that we've been exposed to, which is why you're finding that. And maybe this is where some of that whole the breakdown of chronic fatigue and long hauls COVID. I mean, I want to actually understand what that means. Is it linked specifically to the COVID virus, the long haul COVID, or is this such a weakness or a breakdown, or there's so much of the toxic 5 present in someone's body that any virus is going to put them into this state, or is it specific to the coronavirus?
It is a combination. So the toxic 5 kind of sets the stage. And then the spike protein COVID virus becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. So it does require the virus, though people, traditionally chronic fatigue syndrome and chronic fatigue really came from people having a bad flu, having, a bad virus, a bad infection of some sort of insult. Sometimes they're bitten by a tick or a horsefly, I've even seen, or sometimes they have exposure to mercury. They eat they're on a swordfish diet. Like Tony Robbins was at one point in time, and then he found out he was having some issues and found out that his mercury was sky high because of all the fish that he'd been eating. So it can be from a number of these different toxins that accumulate over your life. And then all of a sudden there's something that becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. In this case, what we're seeing the last couple of years, it's COVID and the spike protein.
Interesting. I teach live yoga classes, and I would say pre 220, like I was very observational about my student population, it's 50 plus, and I would notice that flu season timeframe from maybe October through April, the coughing or the missed classes. And I'm going to say that 219 seemed to be the deeper coughs, the longer coughs, where, everyone was trying to cover their cough. Now, honestly, people don't go out when they have a cough because I think we're also paranoid of getting something. So right. Really, really interesting. Okay, so if you're not running labs, because I run some of the labs that you run or used to run to look for yeast, especially in my population, we all have our specific population, and I'm working with osteoporosis and osteopenia, and I'm looking for the straws that are breaking the camel's back to remove them. And so I find a lot of yeast I do an organic acid test. And also sometimes that shows up in a stool, but I find a lot of yeast. And when I look at the lifestyle of the women, there's a lot of sugar eating. We came from a fat-free generation. We went through a fat-free phase and sugar was the food source. So if you're not running functional labs and you want to look for some of those toxic 5, what are some of the ways that you do that to find out what is the toxic burden, or is this a factor?
So we treat all of them. So that's why I don't test anymore, because I know that everybody that I work with over the last decade and testing people every 3 months for all of those different toxins, I found that, initially the toxins really wouldn't come out, but at month 6, at month 9, at month 12, all of a sudden it's a waterfall of all these toxins coming out. So I don't do the testing initially. I use the testing more for when should we stop treatment. It's kind of like, but I do want to address all of these causes, because what I found is that, first off, the testing isn't great because these urine tests they're really tests of excretion. They're looking at how good you are excreting. They're not really telling us the total body burden, because if you're not excreting well, it's not going to show up in the urine, which is why oftentimes, you do a test initially with somebody, nothing shows up. You do a test 6 months later, all of a sudden there's a bunch in there and they're like, what happened? Why do I have so much more in my body? And the reality is that it's just telling us that now you're excreting a lot better, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that I know enough to know that if I address 99% of the causes that people have, we're going to leave no stone unturned and they're going to be a lot more successful. So that's the other thing too, is that I just don't trust. We can talk about the reason why I don't trust blood labs when it comes to infections also, but I just don't trust labs enough to give me concrete evidence for treating stuff. So I find that it's actually less expensive, saves time, and gets people better faster by just addressing all of them. So I'm addressing not just the heavy metals, all the chemicals, all the molds, but then also the infections, whether it's yeast, bacteria, virus, Lyme co-infections, parasites. We do that and it doesn't cost them much more, take up that much more time, because we're not waiting for labs to come back. We're just moving through a process where we're going to be addressing all these things. I think the other thing that's important to note too about the testing is that all these toxins are really bound up with each other. I call it like a toxic matrix, where heavy metals are bound to yeast, and bound to other infections. We have this information. We know that chemicals and molds can be bound up to each other and then also to the infections. And so when you start to pull out, let's say, heavy metals, and you're just addressing heavy metals, all of a sudden you start to release the other toxic 4. Okay, and so you have to have things on board, binders, chelators, whatever it is, in order to bind these things up, killing infections, so that when they're released, you can actually be prepared to do something about it. So we're essentially addressing all of the toxic 5 as we move through this process, and we're doing it at a rate that the body can tolerate so that people don't feel worse. And oftentimes if they are gonna feel worse, we just want it to be a little blip, so that we can pivot and then keep moving forward.
Yeah, really interesting. So the body has to be even in a state in order to start releasing. Like heavy metals are so toxic that if they're going to be stored in fat, they're stored in bones. I often wonder, and I question everything because we only know what we know, right? Most studies are funded by somebody that has a motivation, and they're done on men, not on women. And I always say, well, 50 men in Greenland, this is what they did. So I'm always like, how do we know about the gut bacteria and that this one's here? Can we even follow vitamin D, the pathway from mouth into the body, going through the digestive tract, getting into the small intestines? Like, what is it like at that level? And what's happening at that level with the commensal bacteria or the opportunistic species? Is it the right pH? Like, there's just so many factors. How do we really know? And when it comes to our body storing all of these, the bones actually store some of these metals. So now when all of the straws are coming on the camel's back, they're starting to release bones, then sometimes some of those metals can come up and come out. So I really like your approach, because when I think about running stool labs and I think about someone who follows it so well, the protocol, using binders, which most of the women I speak to when I ask about their supplement protocol, they've never even heard of what a binder is, right? So some things we don't know about. And then they'll go on a protocol, and then we'll do a stool lab, and then here comes the parasites, and here comes this. And you're right. So I love your approach. If you assume from the beginning that we're all toxic, we all have potential yeast imbalance, bacteria, and parasite imbalance, we go in with balancing the body so it starts to move everything, and we chelate that or bind it, then we have a cleaner system to work through.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I have a 4-step process that we take people through where a lot of it's prep work. Step 4 is removing the toxins in Toxic 5, but the other steps are preparing you for that.
Okay, so I just want to talk about, because what I find, like just thinking about the way you're approaching all of this, we have conventional medicine that sees patients, gives them pills to manage the disease. But my goal is to reverse disease. It's to reverse osteoporosis if you can, if you're in that zone, and if you're in a place where you're able to get your bone markers to a place where we would call it osteopenia, but to at least reverse bone loss. And lifestyle plays such an important role here. So is that part of your first, when you're preparing them, can you tell me some of the lifestyle aspects that you work with?
Absolutely. So step 2 of my process is replacing deficiencies, and we include lifestyle habits in there. So the deficiencies are not enough water, not enough good water, not enough good food, not enough good movement, and not enough good sleep. So those are really the lifestyle habits. Oh, and then not enough good mindset. Those are the real habits that we're working on.
So what was the first step then? The first step?
First step is identifying the causes. So for people who have chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID, we know that they've got the toxic 5, and then they have adrenal gland dysfunction and mitochondrial dysfunction, because you can't have fatigue without having all of those. And then the question is, okay, well, what other hormones are deficient or dysfunctional? And then vitamins and minerals. And then what are the lifestyle habits? So there are some things that we need to determine in step 1, like what is somebody's individual protocol going to be? There are, it's not one size fits all, even though we're treating the toxic 5 on everybody.
And so that's mostly like questionnaires that you're doing intake in the first to kind of feel out. Yeah. So you're doing that intake process to get to know the person, which, it's ironic because you were in a certain model medicine-wise at one point, which does not do a deep dive. It's a 15-minute session. Let me find what your problem is. Oops, here's this thing. Here's the pill for it, right? It's so top-level system management, disease management. What you're doing now is that deeper dive into who's in front of me and what are so it's such a different approach, right? It's total person versus seeing them as a disease. Okay, so you're doing the intake to figure it out, and then you get into those lifestyle pieces. And then third step?
So third step is opening up the exit pathways So this is opening up liver and kidney and lymph and neural lymph, which is the garbage system in the brain, and the gallbladder in the intestines. So this is really, how we help people decrease their symptoms of die-off or Herxheimer reaction or of detox when we go into step 4. And there is a pivot that needs to happen when you're, as you start. If you go too aggressively after heavy metals or chemicals or whatever, you do need to pivot back to step 3 and increase the support that you need so that we can have this flow of toxins flowing out of the body at a rate that the human can tolerate.
Yeah, I think that's really important to note because Herxheimer reactions, it's so interesting how the body, and I don't even know the why behind this, is there a resistance to healing or a protection that the body's in for healing? Because sometimes you feel worse before you feel better. You get like, and if your population has chronic fatigue and potentially long haulers, is that what it's called?
Long COVID,
long COVID, then there might even be more because it can mimic a cold, right? The headaches, feeling lethargic, nausea.
Yeah, in general, it's going to cause symptoms that are already being caused by a particular substance that you're trying to remove. So for example, if Bartonella, which is a particular infection that can cause pain on the bottom of the feet, muscle cramps, sleep issues, anxiety, depression, if somebody, let's say, has those symptoms and they start killing Bartonella, those symptoms potentially will get worse. I tell people, if you feel worse or you feel better, we're on the right track because we're killing that thing or removing that thing. But we only want you to feel just an itty bitty bit worse, right? So that just tells us that something is happening and that we're on the right track.
Yeah. Why is that? There's like a resistance from the species or from whatever it is we're going after. It's always so interesting to me that there is that, because for some people, and this is why it's important to work with someone like you that can actually slow it down and manage it appropriately. Because if you go too hard, too fast, you feel worse. And then you say, why the heck am I doing this?
Right. So there's a couple different reasons why it happens. I think the best way to explain it is really by thinking about the image of a funnel. So when you're starting to get these toxins out of your body, you're reaching into the tissues where they're living, you're binding them up, you're pulling them out into the bloodstream. And then they're trying to get out of the body through the urine and through the stool for the most part. And so these pathways that are in the liver and the kidney, etc., it's kind of like you're dumping these toxins into the top of this funnel. And now, depending on how wide the bottom of this funnel is, determines how fast you can dump these toxins, right? If the bottom is completely wide open, it's like a waterfall. You can just grab as many toxins as you want. But the reality is that the more toxins you have in your body, the more clogged these detoxification pathways are. So everybody that I see when they first come to work with me, most likely their pathways are very clogged and the bottom of this funnel is restricted. So we have to, in step 3, we're kind of opening it up a crack. And then as we start to dump the toxins in, if they start to overflow back into the body, the immune system reacts. You get a cytokine storm and different aspects of the immune system react. And that's when you get the Herxheimer reaction. That's when you get the inflammation in the body. So it really is moving at a rate that the person can tolerate. So I tell people, if you think of your body kind of like a rain barrel, we're drilling a hole in the bottom and we only want it to really trickle out. Because, slow and steady wins the race. The body likes small changes. And essentially, you're going to do so much better if you're just detoxifying at a slower rate.
Yeah, it's a really important thing. Can I ask you a question? Do you do coffee enemas or recommend coffee enemas?
We do in some people. Coffee enemas require a lot of work, and when people are tired, it's kind of hard for them to do. You got to get down on the ground, you got to make the coffee, you got to hang the coffee, you got to hold the coffee, all that. But coffee enemas can definitely be helpful for folks who can't tolerate oral things or who want to supplement it. We have lots of good tools for mitigating Herxheimer reactions, and coffee enemas are one of them.
Yeah, I do a detox every year, and I did my first one like 3-4 years ago. And even as the functional health coach that I am, that's one of the things we were recommending. I just never wanted to recommend that because I still was a little bit leery about it. And it's really amazing. I mean, they're really amazing, but you're right. No, even though I've done, a decent amount over the 3 years, I only do it when I'm doing a detox. And it's a lot of work. It is. And it feels amazing. You could feel really like relieved. Do you know anything about heaviness in the bowel area when you're doing a detox? Like what is that one of the maybe Herxheimer or just even one of the reactions of feelings of detoxification? You feel like you have a bowling ball in your lower bowels. Have you heard of that before?
Is it similar to feeling constipated?
I think I've experienced it, but also just the heaviness is the words that are used, like a heaviness. Not that you're feeling constipated per se, which I feel would be more isolated in the center of your body, but rather like you just put a bowling ball in your pelvis.
Interesting. I haven't heard that one.
Okay. I thought maybe you had heard that. Okay. So how long does this process take, or what are the determining factors of the length of time at which it takes?
Yeah, we tell everybody that it takes at least 12 months. So we start people off with a 6-month program and then they can renew that. But, having that expectation, I think, has been really helpful for folks. And I say at least because depending on the number of causes that they have, the severity of those causes, how long they've been sick, it can definitely last longer. But generally, people are going to be 60 to 100% better. At 12 months, we did a survey a couple years ago that indicated significant improvement of 87% of people at 12 months. And we have over 100 testimonials on our website. So, the process works. It's just a question of how long it takes. So part of the mindset work that we do, which is always good no matter what you're doing in life, is, having this acceptance for where you are and this vision for where you want to go. So that you can understand how long it takes. And for most people who've been struggling for 3, 4, 10, 15, 20 years with chronic fatigue or with COVID, just the last couple of years, it's definitely worth it to them once they feel like they've tried everything, because they haven't tried everything, but oftentimes they kind of get to a point where they feel like that, but if they haven't addressed, 10 times out of 10, when I look at somebody and I meet with them on these free calls that we have, they haven't addressed the toxic 5. I've actually never met anybody who has significantly and completely addressed their toxic 5 and hasn't gotten better.
Yeah, and I would say it's the same thing. The question we asked at the beginning was that link between bone health. And the bones are the bank that stores our minerals. Our minerals are needed for a lot of the mechanisms we're speaking about here, right? Energy production, 6 out of the 8 sections of the Krebs cycle, magnesium is utilized there. So you have, and not all the magnesium's in the bones, I think about 40%. And then I'm like, how do we know that? They say 40% of magnesium's in your bones, the rest is in your heart and your nerves. I'm like, how do we know that? Like, how do we really know that? I want to know. We say 99% of calcium's in your bones. How do we know that? I question everything. I want to know how we know that. But the bones storing what we need to run the show. So when I'm trying to empower women to take control of their bone health, they might not all have chronic fatigue or issues. Yet so much of what you're saying, the straws on the camel's back that's going to lead to bone density loss, lead to chronic fatigue, or weaken your immune system so that you cannot fight off infections and have something for a longer period of time. Those factors are similar in all of them, like what you were saying.
Right. Yep.
Okay, so the other 2 pillars, right? We brought in the other pillar, because you brought in 4, right, when we talked about the toxins. The last one's intriguing to me. Is this more adrenal-based and mitochondrial-based? What was your 4th pillar? I mean,
So I'll go through them again. So the first one is figuring out the causes that an individual has. That's step 1. Step 2 is replacing the deficiencies. So this is where we do adrenals, mitochondria, thyroid, sex hormones. So it's hormones, it's mitochondria, it's vitamins, it's minerals, and then it's lifestyle habits. And so this is all to prepare for step 4, removing the toxins. So we do adrenals and mitochondria in step 2 because that gives people a nice uptick in their energy. It helps to, they have all these deficiencies, but these deficiencies are actually caused by the toxic 5 in step 4. When you get rid of the toxic 5, then it's just really you trying to deal with society. And yes, it does help to continue to consume adrenals and mitochondrial function, but you're not getting them drained the way that you are with the toxic 5. So step 2 is replacing the deficiencies. Step 3 is opening the exit pathways. And step 4 is removing the toxic 5.
So do you see that when we talk about straws for the camel's back, it's a great way to look at causal factors here. Where does mindset or stress and stress management play a role here?
Yeah, it's huge. And so the fifth toxic five is nervous system dysfunction. And so this is mental, emotional, or physical stressors. They'll all cause nervous system dysfunction. And it may be from trauma, whether it's what we consider to be big T trauma, really significant abuse growing up, or just the fact that you're raised by imperfect people and surrounded by imperfect people, just all trying to get their needs met, whether it's your siblings or whether it's kids at school, right? We're influenced by imperfect humans, which influence us, and we're imperfect. And consequently, that all leads to nervous system dysfunction. So doing nervous system retraining is something we introduced in our program about 6 months ago, and just a really important part of this whole process, because we don't know whether someone's nervous system dysfunction is 10% of their issue or 90%. So we have some people who come in, can't really tolerate a lot of supplements, do a bunch of nervous system retraining, and consequently then they can tolerate the supplements, their energy increases, so it's really an important complement of all the work that we're doing.
I would say 2024 was super eye-opening for me in this space in particular when we come to trauma. And I just interviewed somebody on trauma that was so intriguing. The word stress, 90% of all illness is linked to stress, right? Too much toxin in the body, too many things. But she really explained to me that when it becomes trauma, lifelong trauma, when we switch from what the body can manage into the cellular level, when the body then goes in and the mitochondria is affected, when that the cell danger response is triggered. Mm-hmm. So really important, the mental, emotional. In 2024, I think what became so apparent for me is that this piece that we're talking about is that mental emotional layer, and how I do a lot of gut work healing because I want to optimize digestion, absorption, and assimilation. So we've got to do gut, and it's not just about supplements. It's some of what you're saying, removing foods, bringing in good foods, and finding that balance. But really that mental emotional piece, and not being able to bring in supplements or being scared of supplements to help. I just see the mindset playing such a role in so many aspects of disease.
Yeah, we have a 4-step process that we take people through: gratitudes, envisioning your ideal life, your ideal health, flipping limiting beliefs into empowering beliefs, and then asking yourself empowering questions. And that's then in addition to the nervous system retraining component. But a lot of people don't realize that we all have trauma. It might not be big T trauma like sexual abuse or physical abuse or anything like that, but it can be little t, like I had, like rejection of a peer group, being brought up by imperfect humans, and having siblings where we're all kind of competing to get our needs met, being bullied, breakups, going through school. And then on top of all those things, then you get the physical. So the other toxic 4, the heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, all of those will also cause nervous system dysfunction. So yeah, it is a very important part of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and I think it's lovely because where you spent a lot of your career was in a model that was looking at the body and just the body. And so I'm a yoga therapist. So for me, all disease begins in the mind. It doesn't begin in the gut the way that Western medicine looks at it. Like we're looking at the body. I'm like, no, what happened up here? This is what makes us eat the foods we eat, have the thoughts we have, and it's not even just who we are today. It's who we came through, right? That allowed us to survive to be where we are today. So we have the nervous system of our grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and whatever they had to survive through in order to survive that patterning that exists in us. And they've done some studies on this. Do you know about the mice studies with the cherry blossoms out of, I think it was Utah State, or do you know about the mice and the cherry blossoms?
That was like Ancestral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, where they did something to the grandparents. I don't know if they shocked them or what. And you know what else is interesting? We share like 90% of our DNA with mice or rats, which is why we use them for studies. I'm like, what? 90% of me is that little gray thing with a long tail. So they did something with the grandparents. I think they shocked them. They didn't, and they had cherry blossoms. So they exposed them to cherry blossoms and to a shock. Then they didn't do it to the parents. So the next generation, they did not do that to them. Then when the grandchildren were shown a cherry blossom, they had a similar nervous system reaction. It's crazy. So this is a big, deep place to go when it comes to all of this. And I think chronic fatigue, Epstein-Barr, those were words that I started to hear in my, in the 80s or 90s. I started to hear those words, and now we're much deeper into this toxic world we've been living in for all these years. So we're going to be more layered.
Right. Part of my story, I had chronic fatigue syndrome for 5 years, and my grandparents fled Germany to get away from the Holocaust. And I had great grandparents who died. So I know that that's in my DNA, and I know that I feel like that's been a chronic stressor, in my journey.
Yeah, it's really interesting for us to even think that beyond, and it's not about woo-woo and, you're going out of whatever religious beliefs you were raised in to think that there's something beyond, but really we came through our grandparents and whatever was happening in their life. And so it's really something to pay attention to, because if we don't address all of the things, like I love that you have steps. I mean, you said so many different things here. You have steps and you have program and you have, the toxic for the 4-step, the 5th step, right? You have a lot of different ways of looking at this, and they all need to be done. It's not about doing just one. And I think that's what happens. That's what I noticed, probably what you noticed, that grasping at straws. Ooh, isn't that interesting, Evan? So we grasp for straws or at straws, and we're talking about straws on the camel's back. So it's really, I've never thought about that link, because I use the what's the last straw on the camel's back. I use that too. And then I also say that when women come to me, they're grasping at straws. I see them, I'm taking my vitamin D, I'm taking my calcium, I'm taking my vitamin K, now maybe MK4, because there was one study that showed that it reduced femur neck fractures, and it's in natto and in butter. And I'm like, should everybody be in Japan? Like, is it only in Japan with a fermented soybean that we have this natural source of the MK variety, the K2 that we need? Really? So it is the straws. They're looking at straws. And I love your systematic approach. And you're actually educating me on this and the way that I'm approaching women, because I used to run so many functional labs. My bigger clients that I'd work with, I ran a lot of labs. And then I got to the point where I always had to start with, what are you thinking? How are you moving? And what are you eating? And what not to eat. So that's kind of where I've gone a little bit more in my work also.
Wonderful.
Okay, so, and I'd love to, I don't know how much of your backstory I should say, but you were on a journey, on a path as a physician. Mm-hmm. Right? And now you've moved more into what you've learned in your programs, which it's the mind-body complex.
Right. Yeah. I have my MD and I use it, but I don't practice as an MD anymore. So I operate as a coach online so that I can help people across state and national lines. We have about 10% of people internationally in our program. Canada, Europe, New Zealand, Australia. So yeah, it's, I feel really blessed to have had chronic fatigue syndrome, believe it or not, because it taught me so much, and I wouldn't be on this path if it wasn't, and be able to help so many people.
Yes. And I love the journey. Yeah. We've all, like, our mess is our success. That's what they always say. I have a hip replacement I had when I was 51. It's like, what? And that's why I got into bone health the way that I did. But yeah, I love, the term. Most of who is on my show is functional MDs. They might still be practicing, or they're giving up or moving away from their license. I love that I don't have a license, because I could say things a little more edgy. And I love that. The term I'm hearing often now is bad medicine. I do not want to teach. I don't want to practice bad medicine, because it doesn't work. It's putting a Band-Aid on a situation that doesn't get better. And you're actually seeing results and doing something. And I love the work that you do. So Evan, can you explain how someone works with you, what your process is?
Absolutely. So what I found is that success really is this combination of figure out the causes that an individual has, take supplements and do therapies that are going to fix each of those causes, and then have really great support and hand-holding along the way. Because the reality is that there's always going to be bumps through this process, and you want to make sure that there's a lot of access to somebody who knows what they're doing to support people. So that's how we created our program. So we start people off with a curriculum that they're working through. They fill out a form, I review the form, I create a personalized plan for them that tells them the supplements that I recommend and the therapies that I recommend for them to do for each of the causes that they have. I tell them exactly how to introduce these so that they're not taking them all at the same time, so we can see what's affecting what. And then we provide really great support along the way. So, people can have access to me. I guarantee a response to any question in our community in 2 business days, which means I answer questions on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. My health coach answers questions on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because that response time, I think, is really important for people if they're going through something. And then we have live Q&A calls with me that happen 3 times a month. So almost every single week. There's one-on-one calls with us. There's SOS calls if you need them. There's nervous system retraining curriculum as well. So that's what I found to be most successful. And then, people are working through this process of the 4 steps, where, they're introducing they're replacing their deficiencies in step 2, replacing or opening up their detox pathways in step 3, and then the majority of the time really is spent removing the toxic 5. That's really what takes, the majority, because it's like a month for step 2, a month for step 3, and then it's, somewhere between 9 and 18 months for step 4.
Yeah, I think it's important. So here's the most important aspects of what you're doing is the communication and the ability to get you, the expert, to have the SOS calls, to have you and even your team that you've hired, your health coach, you're also interacting with all them. That's really important. I know that in my work that I do, that's one of the things that women love, is to have the ability to ask questions. If you do a program where you go and you're doing all this DIY, they just do something themselves, you need support. You need either community support with the program, or you need a practitioner or an expert to be there to answer questions, especially when you're doing something like what you're doing when it comes to detoxification. Because if somebody hasn't done that yet, the Herxheimer reaction that we're saying is a real thing, where you feel terrible and you might be inclined to quit. So to know that that's something you have, and then the fact that you customize it is great too. So I think with anyone is going to be managing detoxification, which you're doing detox too, right? You're an energy specialist, an expert, but you're also the detox part. So that needs to be a part of that, is that they have your team. That's a really important part. And I say to anyone going through any programming to make sure that there's an expert that you can speak to ask these questions.
That's available, that's readily available, right? Expeditiously available. Because, everybody that I speak to, they've got a story of, I felt worse and I couldn't get my questions answered.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's true. I know there's one woman I think about all the time in my program. She paid a lot of money to have this program, and it was more DIY. She could do like calls, but most of the time it was DIY. And she said she sat there in her living room. She tried, and she got her husband to come and listen to it also. And she said, I just started crying, and I told my husband, I'm not smart enough for this, to learn this, whatever she was being taught. And so to have the human, live, interactive, having someone available, and it sounds like you guys are available 5 days a week.
Right. Well, and the other thing too is that, we don't have big lectures. I tell people that what we're offering is transformation, not more information. It's like, here's the minimum amount of information that you need in order to get better. It's like, here are your causes, here are the supplements to take, here's a Google sheet that walks you through exactly how to do that, right? You don't have to know the function of the adrenal gland and the mitochondria and how it interacts and this, that, and the other thing, those toxins. You don't have to know that stuff. If you want to get better and you want to have that transformation, you don't need to spend hours sitting in front of a computer screen, watching videos. The
trust that's developed in you as the expert at this point then also plays a role here, right? I think maybe the more information that's being given out is maybe if the practitioner themselves doesn't really understand it, the fact that you've done this for so long and you've weeded out what works, what doesn't work. It is, here's what to do, here's how to do it. Do you have any questions? And let me know how you're feeling along the way. And then I can't wait to see you have lots of energy and feel better.
Presto. Exactly.
Yeah. Presto. So how can those listening find you?
So I'm at EnergyMD Method.com. And if you go there, you can learn all about what we have to offer, get on a free masterclass. If our philosophies jive and you want to see if we're a good fit to work together, you can get on a free call with me.
Yeah. So the MD, you might have to think of some words for that. Not if you're, yes, you're a medical doctor. Like my initials are DR. So it's like, okay, Dr. Debbie. I'm not licensed. But yeah, I was trying to think what would that MD stand for that talks about what you do. Anyway, okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for sharing with us. And I'll have those links below in the show notes and send people your way. Because I think what you're doing really, the monitoring aspect of getting rid of heavy metals and all of these toxins can't just be done alone. It really can't. It needs to be monitored because there are those Herxheimer reactions that you'll go through, and you are just grasping at straws until you actually systematically manage it in the way that you're doing. So I love the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Debbie.
Yes.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining me on Stronger Bones Lifestyle. Are you ready to take charge of your future? For show notes, resources, and information on my programs, please visit DebbieRobinson.com. If today's episode empowered you, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs it. Together, we're building stronger bones and stronger lives. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode.